welcome Caitlin Swalick from globalenergymonitor.org, or GEM for short, to the Geospatial Index. Really happy to have you here. Let's get straight into it. Could we please hear the elevator pitch for GEM?
Sure, thanks, Will. So Global Energy Monitor is a nonprofit research think tank. That's one of the ways we describe ourselves. We're a group of around 75 or so individuals that focus on energy and climate change research. So we put together a set of databases that are focused on different parts of the world's energy sector. And we've also recently moved into a focus on heavy industry, which is the program that I oversee. So that's mainly looking at iron and steel production. So all of our data sets are asset level, meaning that we collect information about the plants and or units at those plants. That includes ownership, location, other information about like capacity, production methods, and all of our data sets are completely free to use. We strive for public resources for all of the data sets, so we make it very transparent, and they're quite widely used by the IEA, the International Energy Agency, the UN's environmental program, for heavy industry, World Steel Association and the OECD both use it. And then we're also part of the Climate Trace Initiative. So quite a lot of users, which is great.
Oh, you've got some really nice high profile partnerships and clients there, I guess. So it's an inspiring example, given that all of your trackers somehow have a spatial or a map component. To me, it's an inspiring example of how our discipline, geospatial, can help the world. So one thing I try to do in all of these episodes is somehow to define the niche that each of the guest organizations or companies serve. So you mentioned energy there. You also mentioned heavy industry. Is it right to begin to define the niche based on, I guess, the part of the world or human society you're trying to illuminate, or is it better to think of your niche in terms of the profession like journalism that you're trying to serve? What niche are you trying to dominate?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think GEM views itself as an organization like we're providing really high quality data sets, trying to capture the best picture of what's happening in the energy system and heavy industry system through this open source data, so that whether it's campaign groups or policymakers, academic researchers, even private companies that are coming and using our data sets, they're all basing their information off the same numbers. I mean, our mission ultimately is to support the climate movement and campaign and policy works, especially any like grassroots activism. We try to highlight all of that through our wiki pages. So for every plant or asset that's in our database, which is typically like one line of data, every single one of those has a wiki page tied to it that has all of the data from our database up, but then also a lot of extra background information that our researchers come across as they're collecting that data, whether that's information on like ground level campaigns that are happening, environmental compliance issues, features in the news. So there's a whole wealth of knowledge on our wiki. And it's just a really easy, accessible way to get to the data for folks that aren't as comfortable with databases. They can still get a lot of information about these individual plants by looking at our wikis.
Yeah, gee, it's an incredible resource. So did I get it right that you started in 2007?
Yes, so Global Energy Monitor started as Coal Swarm in 2007.
Coal Swarm, I love it.
Yes, Coal Swarm, yeah. And at that point, I believe it was very small. It was maybe 3 to 5 people total, not even all full-time, but basically like a journalist, an academic, a campaigner, and a researcher. And they started with our coal power tracker. That was kind of our first major project at GEM, and it really took off and was really widely used by so many different groups. And then from there, we've just grown out into all of these different trackers. In 2019, GEM changed its name to its current one, Global Energy Monitor. But through all that time, we've been putting out a newsletter called Coalwire that also covers a lot of updates and news on the coal industry. It's expanded from focusing just on coal power to now coal mines, coal finance, metallurgical coal, which ties into our heavy industry work. And then we also have a gas newsletter. And then I help to co-edit another newsletter on heavy industry. So a lot of information coming out.
Wow. I got my work cut out just to stay across everything you guys produce. Yeah, I was actually really excited when I was doing a bit of background research about some of the trackers you guys are maintaining, because actually my geospatial career started on a coal seam gas field project in southeast Queensland, a large state in the northeast of Australia. I was involved in the Gladstone liquid natural gas upstream project. So I was basically helping to locate pipelines and well pads to double the size of a couple of gas fields that then sent gas on the GLNG pipeline northeast to, I think, Curtis Island, where there was a gas compressor train that was also being built. So it was really interesting to sort of reflect on, like, because I ultimately actually ended up resigning from, and started a pattern actually in my career of resigning from a number of projects and companies because of, having some reservations about what was being done. But it just made me realize how significant it was, what we were doing, that a tracker like yours had profiled and researched not only that ultimately compressor train and everything upstream of it, but the APLNG one, and there was another compressor train. It was fascinating to have the outsider's perspective, and for it to actually confirm, some of the reasons why I chose to move on. I actually, funnily enough, ended up taking a volunteer position with Engineers Without Borders in Cambodia.
Oh wow!
Instead of the same
so
week.
Interesting.
Yeah, like I got offered a very basic, allowance to survive, as a GIS volunteer in Cambodia. And the same week I got an offer as a geospatial engineer in the field, fly in, fly out. You can imagine what the salary difference was for FLIR on that same project.
I can only imagine.
Yeah, so this is not a podcast about me, but I wanted to. It was I really appreciated. It's almost like going full circle in my career, and it was nice to have a connection with what you guys are doing. And I think maybe a lot of us, especially on the resource side or the oil and gas, etc., exploration side in geospatial, will have a personal connection with the trackers and what you guys are doing.
Yeah, I can imagine. That's interesting to hear. And I mean, I think that's one really important thing these trackers do is create context for individual projects. Because like yourself, or anybody that, lives near one of these sites or works near one of them, you perhaps don't get a sense of how it compares in scale to other projects. And it's also a way to understand, the parent company who's driving that project, where else are they involved? Like what overall messages are they sending? Like where are they investing and whatnot? So I think that your story is a really good example of how our trackers create a lot of that context for individual projects.
Yeah, and I guess, as you might know, and others who've listened to other episodes know, I have a focus here on the financial side of geospatial. And I appreciated you mentioning that there's somehow a coal finance tracker, and I think I saw some other finance-related trackers on GEM's website. Another aspect, at least as an Australian, in terms of the experience of all of this gas exploration and export for Australians. And I would be happy to be corrected, but my understanding is that, for example, the gas royalties that Qatar extracts as part of the exploitation of their gas fields is far higher than the royalties that the Australian public enjoys from a similar level of gas export. So I don't know if you guys look into that aspect of the financing, but that's something that's important to look at. I think where natural resource exploitation is going on, really how much it is benefiting the local population. The most farcical thing that I heard of was that in Australia they had to build a gas import terminal. I kid you not, for gas to be re-imported back in on ships. I think in Victoria, a southeastern state, simply because the Australian government hadn't ensured that local demand for that resource was being met.
Wow, yeah, that's fascinating. I don't know off the top of my head if we have somebody on our team working on gas finance in that way, but I know that if we're not, we have collaborators that are. Finance is one of the major uses of our databases, and we're certainly getting more interested in trade and also generally like interlinking our data sets. For example, we have a coal terminals tracker that pulls in data from our steel plants, coal mines, coal plants, trying to illuminate something on what's happening with coal trade in the world. We largely focus on the actual like sites of production and extraction. But yeah, the next natural step is to actually look at the trade flows. And another piece there that you alluded to is, environmental justice. And, what we know that there's impacts of extraction and production on those surrounding communities. But then, as you said, like, the companies that are driving these projects, where are the profits from the projects going?
Yes.
Something we've tried to do on our coal mine tracker and our steel plant tracker is to add in workforce size data too. Because interestingly, at least for steel plants, one of the main arguments against switching to some of these lower emissions technologies is that the plants don't require as many workers. So you'll ultimately lose jobs. So we've been trying to collect workforce data to get an idea of how true that is. But it gets complicated because, like, one, the quality of the data really varies depending on how companies are reporting it. But then you also think that, you might be looking at a reduction in the number of workers at a specific plant when they change technology. But it's also all of those upstream processes. If they're producing hydrogen somewhere else to be able to run that low emissions plant, that's a whole set of jobs that might not be accounted for. So yeah, the data piece, it gets really tricky setting up these boundaries on what we're collecting.
Yeah. This might sound a bit dramatic, but honestly, I almost feel like I've been waiting most of my career to have this conversation, only because I had so many unanswered questions and I just didn't feel comfortable on that project, so I had to leave. So it's really interesting. It's a moment for me. I'll say that, Caitlin. So I'm really grateful to be able to have this conversation.
I'm glad to hear that. Thank you. It's great that you have this personal connection to bring. So.
Yeah. And I also feel like we've got some nice segues there onto the next question. So I'll just say it this way. So I'm starting to focus on spatial finance finally in this podcast. For example, there was an epic blog post that came out of my last chat with Synmax, where I had a really inspiring conversation with Eric Anderson, their CTO. It also led to a bit of an investigation into Bill Perkins' career, possibly the most famous living natural gas trader. who has basically founded SkyFi and SynMax. So out of all of it, and I've also interviewed Luke Fisher, the CEO of SkyFi. So out of all of this, and also from my initial inquiries and I guess encounters with spatial finance through the Spatial Finance Initiative, ultimately from Ben Caldicott's team, which is where I came across GEM through you guys doing a presentation in one of their annual state and trends reports. I basically have sort of come to understand there's three themes. You've got financial geography, which is basically examining why some places are wealthier or more financially active than others. And I think we're touching on some of those themes there when we're starting to get into environmental justice, impacts on the workforce, how profits from resource projects actually benefit local people. So I think it's nice to see that we're already covering that. Then there's spatial finance for academics. So that's what Ben Caldicott's team does. But essentially, there seems to be a focus on environmental justice in a lot of academic work to do with spatial finance. And then there's spatial finance for traders. So for those, there's a focus on asset or field production estimates. So long question here, but am I right in situating GEM under the academic version of spatial finance, or are you affiliated with something else altogether? I think you're starting to cover this, but let's try to cover that a bit more.
Yeah, that's a great question. And truthfully, I mean, GEM isn't doing a ton of that spatial finance work in-house ourselves. We do have our coal finance tracker and a few other projects, but largely we're collaborating with other groups that are doing this work. And I believe we have projects that are covering all three of those categories. We have worked really closely with Spatial Finance Initiative. They had initially put together, at the same time that we were putting together our steel plant tracker, they were putting together a steel plant tracker using AI technology. And it was great to collaborate because what we found is that their data set with the AI tech, they were able to collect information on a lot more plants, but they weren't getting the same depth of data that we got by like digging in on each plant, pulling out the ownership, the technology type, the capacity. So our data sets complemented each other really well. We were able to go through and link all the plants together. So that was a really nice example of, collaborating to build a much more comprehensive data set. And then we've also worked closely with the group Asset Resolution, which is now renamed Asset Impact. And they do modeling for investors on climate risk, looking at different assets that those organizations are invested in. So that's a really interesting and cool use of our data. And then,
So
we
that
also
might be
have...
then, sorry, that might then specifically be the spatial finance for traders then.
Yes.
That grouping that I could
Yeah,
come up with better
and they're
name, but
not... I mean, we've built a very close relationship with them, but there are other groups that are also using our data in that way. So groups that are interested in like ESG scores, climate risk, anybody can access our data set. So we have lots of people that are accessing it, and when they download our data, the only thing we ask is that you provide your name and what you're using the data for. And that just helps us understand who's using the data, how we can best service our users. And through that, we've seen that there's a lot of folks using it that way. There's also quite a lot of private companies that are using our data to understand like where the market is at. And I think sometimes there are mixed feelings about whether that's a good thing or not, because obviously not all those users are going to be mission aligned with us. Their interest might be, in making a profit rather than, or like seeing who is still buying metallurgical coal. But at the end of the day, our theory of change is that it's still better to be providing this open data source that puts everybody, campaigners, policymakers, private industry on the same page. And, at least for the steel industry, we've seen that in the last year, providing this data is not stopping is not stopping momentum from growing. We are seeing, you know, consumers of steel actively push for green steel production. We're seeing pressure on companies to stop investment cycles and to move to cleaner technologies and to, you know, count coal emissions as part of their emissions. So
and it's so wonderful because like all of your trackers can show at a global scale the momentum and this transition for all of these really important assets for changing our footprint. So
yeah, that's absolutely true. And that's one of the things I'm most excited about with our heavy industry program right now. We started it in 2020, had our first data release in 2021. So we're now actually getting to the point where we can start to have like time series and see, you know, how proposals for steel plants are shifting technologies, and actively watch these plants start to be shut down or reinvested in or shifted. And so that's something that I'm super excited about.
You're basically tracking things at the point of emissions.
Yes.
And what produced those emissions. It's great way to have your finger on the pulse of, and it's an important pulse here.
Absolutely. Cool. And I think pairing up with Climate Trace, being part of that initiative, is a really exciting move for us too, because Climate Trace is a group that is using remote sensing to try and get real-time emissions from these point sources. So it is such a perfect pairing for GEM, where we have gone to Google Maps and identified like the exact location of the smokestacks on all of these plants, for them to be able to then go and train their models to know where these plants are already, and then track in real time production and emissions.
There's also a linkage here with Skyfi, because Skyfi is a tasking platform for every Earth observation constellation that happens to be on it, and you can essentially subscribe to a patch on the Earth, and any constellation that's passing a sensor over it, you get data. There's all sorts of collaborations and linkages.
Yeah, and we encourage all of them. Our biggest ask is just when you're finding something cool with our data, let us know. That form that I described that gets filled out, you might think that it's just a silly form that nobody looks at. I read every single intake form for my trackers because I love to know how people are using the data.
Yeah, and what you're talking about with Climate Trace also relates to Transition Zero in discussions with them to also bring them onto the podcast.
Oh, great. Cool. Yeah, we've worked very closely together with them. Their methodology for the steel emissions on Climate Trace, we worked really closely together, and that was all trained with the Global Steel Plant Tracker. So
sounds like you're all working together. Cool.
Yes, I think it's kind of a common, the usual suspects.
No, I love it. Each of these episodes is I'm advancing my investigative journalism skills. I'll put it that way.
You could start a little like mind map.
I did start one of those crazy diagrams. A pin boards and string.
That's what you're hiding with your virtual background there.
That's right. Nobody knows. I'll reveal it one day.
Great.
Actually, I should say my background is relevant. It's from Felix Ferrand and Globaya, who've been around since the beginning of my career. And actually, some of the visualizations and animations of the impact of the Anthropocene and the advance of the Anthropocene expressed via flight paths, shipping lines, railway networks, road networks, gas pipeline networks, cable networks. The visuals that Felix put together were part of influencing me to stay true to my ideals and unfortunately, exit that gas project. There's a whole confluence of different things going on here for me.
Yeah, that's interesting. Well, and one other thing I'll note too, I mean, it's been great to see our gas team grow, and they have these really incredible infrastructure trackers that are focused on pipelines, and that's That really advanced a lot more of our mapping at GEM, because it's one thing to have a data set that's a bunch of points. That's very easy to map. But once we started working with these pipelines where you'd have to have multiple coordinates to show like the actual different routes, that work got a lot more complicated. So we really like beefed up our mapping team there. And it's been really cool too to see in the last couple years more efforts to integrate across different trackers at GEM. So I mentioned the coal terminals, but also like within the gas team, they're linking their pipelines and plants. And then we're also thinking about a lot of transitions and technologies. So like coal plants moving over to gas, or ultimately being replaced by renewables, which are a whole new set of trackers we have. So we're trying to link all of our trackers together so that you're not just getting a view of what's happening within one of these sectors, just the coal power sector, but you're actually starting to see that full like scope of the energy sectors, that coal being replaced by gas or renewables, or just being shut down.
Okay. Yeah, and it offers an integration of all of those trackers would offer a more comprehensive impression of humans' footprint in terms of energy production, and transport.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. So I feel like this could turn into a multiple hour session, but maybe we try and get through the agenda and see what happens. An important next couple of questions are. I think the next couple of questions are important, though, in terms of, again, how popular you are and what kind of impact you're having. So you said you've got a questionnaire or a form that somehow helps you track user signups. So how fast actually is user growth for GEM's trackers or the website overall?
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, our coal trackers have somewhere over like 4,500 users. Our heavy industry trackers are over 1,500 users, and that's just in a couple of years. Those are individual users too. We have a lot of folks that come back repeatedly. And that's, I mean, like I said, that includes organizations like the IEA. We might have one download from the IEA, but they're using that data extensively. So growth, I mean, I don't have the exact numbers, but we've certainly seen a big uptick in users over the last year. I think especially as we moved into some new sectors, adding renewables, that kind of put us at the point where we were tracking all of the major energy sectors. We had our coal and gas, and then added renewables and all of these other power projects. So like hydro, nuclear, etc. And so once we had that full scope, we have just seen our usage explode.
Okay.
And I can see it, just in a bar chart of users that we have for our own trackers. It's growing every month.
Yeah. Oh, that's great news. That's really.
Yeah.
Going off track a little bit here, but I wanted to say this before I forgot. We touched briefly on the idea of environmental justice, but the thought occurred to me, what about financial justice, especially where, again, the local population doesn't benefit as much as the companies that are doing the extraction. I don't know if you wanted to get into a discussion of that, or if that topic has already come up within your circles, but it seems like a powerful concept to me.
Yes, it certainly has. And I mean, I'll admit my experience with this is mostly focused on our heavy industry work. So a lot of these conversations are coming around the distribution of technologies right now. We're seeing that the more emissions intense steelmaking technology is predominantly installed in Asia and growing in Asia. And so that is one of the biggest conversations we have. We've seen a lot of investment and a lot of tech transitions planned in North America and in Europe. And so that is a question we ask ourselves a lot. Like, is it fair to ask these economies that are still growing and still need to be producing steel to build out the renewable power projects we're asking them to build, and to build like buildings and other infrastructure, and to be doing it using more expensive technology. So that is a question that we're asking a lot. And I think, although GEM doesn't directly put out, policy briefs and whatnot, we work with a lot of other groups that are using our data and developing these policy briefs. And in those, we're often making recommendations about how, like the G7 or certain countries that have already, developed and have a healthy supply of steel scrap, or have already installed most of these low emissions technologies, should be supporting developing economies in transitioning their technology.
There's another. So you mentioned that, for example, steel smelters. There's plenty of them in Korea or China, but not to sound obsessive about this, but only because, again, it maps on, at least as an Australian, to the concept of financial justice, which is that Australia is actually viewed, from an economist perspective, it's actually a very unsophisticated economy. We dig raw materials out the ground, chuck them on ships, and they go off to be refined into products that into steel, that people actually want. In the state that I'm from, South Australia, there is a small steel plant, but on the whole, we don't have the sophisticated manufacturing and industry that takes those raw materials and turns them into, it does high value adding, which then would have significant positive financial implications, again, for Australian society. So that was just another thing that I was reflecting on there, about the financial justice aspect of resource extraction. Anyway, it's a whole conversation that your track has prompted.
Well, no, and it's true. And so there's several different schools of thought about where we should be putting the pressure to drive this green steel transition. So right now there's a lot of groups that are focused on the end product consumers. So putting a lot of pressure on the automotive industry and building sectors, because they're such massive consumers of steel, to be ensuring that the raw materials they're buying, the raw steel production that they're buying is using a low emissions technology. And we've seen quite a bit of success with that route. Certain automakers, committing to purchasing X% of green steel by whatever year. And so what that does is it creates that demand for green steel.
There's a market that could be filled. Yeah.
A differentiated market. It creates incentives for those steel makers to switch to lower emissions technology. But there's a lot of pieces that have to come together. We need better systems for tracking steel emissions and differentiating between these production methods. There has not been as much pressure on the upstream producers, although I think this year we're going to be seeing a lot more pressure on those blast furnaces that use metallurgical coal. And I think that's where we're going to start to see more pressure on the upstream. Pressure on met coal producers.
Yeah, and funnily enough, I actually know that in that state where I'm from, South Australia, and for that steel plant, there is evidence of positive results from, I guess, these pressure campaigns, because the new owner, who happens to actually be English, he has plans to, it's unbelievable really, but somehow to power at least some of the production there using solar power. So it's incredible. Yeah, the transitions, unthinkable really to have solar panels powering one of the most highly energy intensive manufacturing processes.
Absolutely. Well, and this is what I think is so cool about our steel plant tracker, because it's not like our other trackers are pieces of the energy industry. Steel is a different sector, and we are both interested in the production technologies at the plant because that says something about the emissions, but we're also interested in the power that plant is sourcing. Because if you have two electric arc furnace plants, that they're the plants that don't use metallurgical coal in the production, they're lower emissions overall. They're you can think of them as like energy powered plants. Your 2A EAFs could be the exact same configuration, but if one is operating off a grid that's largely coal-based power and the other one has a dedicated renewables project, the emissions intensities from those two steel plants, totally different.
Right, when you consider the whole system, yeah.
Exactly.
Goodness, I really feel like we need to discuss for a lot longer than an hour. Let me do my best here. I'm going to try and ask a compound question. So I'll try and combine two. So one of them was, how are you working backwards from customer needs? But I'd like to link that with a quote. At least reading off, I guess, the mission statement or part of it for GEM. So GEM was founded 2007 on principles of transparency and accountability, with the aim of enhancing the quality of public discourse on energy and the environment. So I wanted to know if there are any examples of how that's happened in the past 16 years, and if your capacity to have that kind of an impact is an expression of your effectiveness in working backwards from your user needs, if that makes sense at all.
Yeah, absolutely. And there are many examples for this. The ones that come to mind for me are, of course, focused on the heavy industry work we do again. One really recent example is a group, the Center for Environmental Research. I hope I'm getting the acronym right. They have been like working on a campaign with ArcelorMittal, which is one of the biggest steel producers in the world. They were the largest in the world for quite a while. They sold off all their North American assets. They have a huge set of assets in Europe, but then also a huge set of assets in India and parts of Africa. And what's really interesting about Arcelor is that they made a bunch of net zero commitments and commitments to lower emissions right before they sold off all their North American assets, specifically their US steel assets. So that was something that we were able to track through our ownership changes to show that, yes, they're suddenly going to show that they have X number fewer of these high emission steel plants, but it's not that steel production and those emissions aren't being produced. It's just that they've changed the ownership. Right. So their footprint, their corporate footprint is lower, but our global footprint is no lower. And another,
this is a great outcome of a global, literally global energy monitor.
It really is. Yeah. Well, and they're a great case study because the other thing they've done is they really divide their European assets out from the rest of their assets. So this group that I was mentioning, CRE, they were looking at how they have really made quite different commitments for their European steel assets in terms of investing in low emission steel technology, their commitments for net zero. And then you compare that to what they're doing with their assets that are in the global south, and they are just continuing to operate business as usual. And I mean, we're still seeing, community-based activism because there's so much like water and environmental pollution happening in those communities. So that's been a really cool way. What I was saying before about how our trackers create context, you can look at one of these plants alone, but then where we track that ownership information, you can actually go and see all of the different assets that one owner has.
Would it be an idea to share your screen whilst you're talking about this? Because you've mentioned the blast furnace tracker a couple of times. That's the latest one that you guys have released. So I'd love to have a bit of commentary, or have the commentary you were making be accompanied by something from.
Oh, here we go.
I'd also be interested to know why you chose to release the blast furnaces tracker as your most recent one. I guess there's a lot of different trackers you guys want to stand up, but why was that one prioritized?
So our blast furnace tracker, Yeah, I mean, we've been releasing a lot of different trackers recently. I wouldn't say it was a particular decision to focus on blast furnaces. But your previous question about whether we respond to user requests, when we released the steel plant tracker, we had a lot of people saying that they were actually really interested in knowing more about the blast furnaces at each plant. Because I'll show briefly here, our steel plant tracker.
Yeah.
Sorry?
You're saying there's a difference between a blast furnace and some other components of the steel plant?
Exactly. So for the steel plant tracker, you can see these are all done at the plant level, and we indicate the exact type of technology at that plant. And we have this capacity view so you can get an idea of where steel is being produced. But we know that this blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace steelmaking route is the most emissions intense, and particularly that blast furnace is the most emissions intense part of the steelmaking process. And what we don't capture at the plant level for the blast furnace units is the exact unit age. We capture the plant age, but each of these units has a really specific lifetime. And what's challenging is these units are built with the expectation that they'll operate for 10 to 15 to 20, 25 years. And that's what it takes to get their return on investment. So we became really interested in actually understanding the exact age of these units so that we can start to get an idea of when these reinvestment cycles are going to be coming up, because those are really good times to put pressure on companies to shut them down or switch to a cleaner technology rather than continuing them. So this blast furnace tracker.
You guys never give these people a break.
Yeah, exactly. This blast furnace tracker is really an extension of the steel plant tracker. So it's actually in the map form, we're using the same steel plant tracker, but just focusing on those blast furnaces. And for each unit here, you actually have to go into our database. But when you open, I'll show the summary stats table, some of those. But here you can download all of the data. Oh, oops, I clicked on the dashboard there. You can download the data here. This is the form I was mentioning. And you're sent an Excel file that includes information on the age of all of these units and when each of those relinings happened. And then we also have our summary stats table here that show the capacity for these different blast furnaces by development status in each country. So like here you can see China has the most operating blast furnace capacity right now. And you can see they have this massive build out of capacity planned. But what's really interesting is that we're seeing, India is catching up quite quickly. So yeah, I'm really excited. This data set only came out not even 2 weeks ago, so we have a lot of work to do digging into it still. And I'm really excited to see how users will dig in, especially with the extra information when you download the data set and you actually get those unit ages. And I want to show on the steel tracker too. Oops, I'm not coming up right here. Okay. Well, I'm not sure why. Maybe I have too many things going on. Here, when you go to a single plant, you can actually click this more info button, and that's going to take you to the wiki page that I mentioned, which includes the map and the coordinates, and then a ton of information about the plant. Now, if I should have chosen a more exciting plant because that's just an EAF. But say here, if we choose, I'm trying to think of a plant that I know well.
I'd be interested to know if you went to that one in South Australia, if you've mentioned the fact that it's supposed to have in the center on the southern coast to the left. Yeah, that one. I've been.
Here.
That's in
The
Whyalla.
Liberty Steel?
Either of them. They're both the same location in Whyalla. Yeah.
Okay. Yes. So if you go to this plant, right, you can see this is one. This is clearly a blast furnace, basic oxygen furnace. I've looked at enough of these. I just know from seeing. And
Because
yeah,
the whole
so
surroundings
here's
are
an
just red.
example. We have a lot more of this background information put in. And then under the plant details, you can see we have details on the blast furnace unit, all of the, the sector end users, the products that they're making, ownership, and then tons of references. We try to make all of our references accessible to anybody. We also link to the company website.
Yeah.
And
you know something about the town. I just want to say, so about the environmental justice aspect here. So, because I used to work a couple of days a week for about a year in Whyalla. If you walk around the footpaths of that town, they're not grey concrete footpaths. They're red. And basically, the whole history of that plant's operation, the local authorities have been lying about the health implications, very obvious health implications of a population essentially under the cloud of pollution. Anyway.
Yikes.
Just want to give you more local context.
I mean, it's wild just taking a look here at the plant location in the town.
Yep.
I mean, I have spent many days just looking at these maps that we have. I think anybody could spend a whole lot of time doing it. It is wild to see where some of these industrial hubs are relative to where people are living.
You're damn right. And there's a nickel plant on the other side of that Gulf. I think that's the Spencer Gulf.
Interesting.
That also was associated with various genetic abnormalities. There's the whole regulation aspect of it. We've got 5 more minutes. I at least wanted to cover maybe one of the more meaningful questions towards the end of the agenda, which is that in the UK, at least, there's something called a geospatial apprenticeship that youngsters can get involved in. I'm not sure about how things are over in California or in the US, but if you guys happened to be on the lookout for an apprentice, what kinds of character traits, technical capacities, ambitions would you look for? At least this is about, fostering a thriving next generation of analysts.
Absolutely. So we've seen, some skills that are really, really helpful are just like general database management, being really comfortable going into these huge spreadsheets, line by line, managing many tabs, any coding skills, even basic R skills or Python, super, super helpful. And then some experience with mapping, whether you have mapping expertise yourself or just experience working with mappers to understand what they're going to be looking for. And, in terms of managing these databases, what we like to see is people that understand what we call like quality assurance, quality control in these data sets. So, if you build out a data set where one column is titled like steel products, and then people just write in whatever products that plant has, that's useful, but it's not that useful when people are trying to analyze with that data because there's no consistency in naming.
Opposed to using a lookup table,
exactly.
A control vocabulary. Yep.
Exactly. So having skills like that are so, so helpful. But ultimately, I would say the people that thrive the most in our roles are people that are really passionate about the work and have some type of personal connection, which with climate change is not that far-fetched. Pretty much everybody does have some type of connection.
You're right. You're right there. Yeah. Okay. Well, we got there. I feel definitely shortchanged, and I hope the listeners do. I hope I get lots of requests for bringing you guys back on.
I would love that. We could definitely do a part 2 and maybe involve some of our other sectors. I think that would be a great idea. And I didn't even touch on our ownership tracker, which is actually going to be linking together the parent companies that are involved in all of these different sectors. So that will be coming out sometime this year, I believe. So maybe that would be a good time to chat again.
Excellent. No, and that actually relates to another unrelated project that I'm engaging in. So no, okay.
Great.
Lots of what's the word? Synchronicities.
Yes, I hope this is only the start.
Me too. Yeah, Caitlin, lovely to meet you.
Yes, you too. Thank you, Will.